My name is David Puttnam, and I'm talking about the great challenges of the 21st century. In fact, I'm part of the 21st century challenge. Well, I mean, what we've been given here is a quite fantastic tool in that young people have adjusted themselves to a particular type of communication technology that certainly didn't exist when I was young. And that technology happens to contain within it the most powerful search engine or learning engine or education engine that's ever been devised by mankind. So in a sense, what we're dealing with is the first brand new technology, the way I see it, in terms of accessibility, since the advent of popular books, where books became inexpensive enough to be able to, for a child to get hold of them, or a library, or be bought them and take them home. And this is something it's quite extraordinary. Also, the sheer inventiveness of young people, their ability to manipulate the technology and to make it work for them, and to extract the learnings that they want from it are amazing. And what I think it's done is it's allowed us to discover several things. Number one, the social imperative, the fact that the way that young people are taken to social networks and social sites is, I would say, to a far greater extent than anyone could have possibly appreciated. So first of all, it proves that human beings are instinctively and intuitively social animals. They're also animals, clearly, who are prepared to share. I mean, when I look back at my own school days, where in fact you're actually actively encouraged in class to sort of put your arm around your learning to make sure that the kid next to you couldn't look at it, in order that you would improve your selfish skills. It's out the window. Today, young people instinctively share their learning, share their skills, collaborate. And that's all of a piece, I think, with what's going to be essential if we're going to navigate our way through the 21st century. So, yes, what we've got is an amazing tool which children have to have taken to like ducks to water, that they've taken to places that we, certainly an adult like me, would not have imagined possible. And now our job, as I see it, is to really just help them sort out the wheat from the chaff, the useful from the useless, because we can't expect the networks that they're operating on and the social sites that they're operating on to do that for us. So our job is really a sifting job. I don't mean in terms of a finger-wagging sifting, but get them to understand how they can judge really useful information. How do they cross-check information? How do they make sure they're not being told a lot of rubbish? So how do they become sophisticated learners? And in an odd way, it's the thing that many years ago we used to call visual literacy. It's media literacy. How do they become literate within the framework of this new medium, and not become duped by it, and not be manipulated by it, or have their views distorted by it? That's the great challenge. I don't think addressing the potential digital or educational divides that the new digitally rich technology will offer is a huge problem within Britain. I mean, our last count, 27% of people in the UK were not online, or were not at all sophisticated in terms of getting online, but a huge proportion of that 27% were the elderly. They tended to come from the lowest income group. So I would think you're probably looking at young people, maybe 10% of young people who could be regarded as technologically disadvantaged. That's something we're going to address. It's too many, way too many. Frankly, 1% is too many. But it is not a vast problem. The really vast problem is the international one. Is the difference between the developed nations and the undeveloped and underdeveloped nations. How do you try and ensure that over the next 20 years, in the short term, over the next 20 years, that the gap between developed countries and developing countries doesn't widen rather than narrow? Now, in some circumstances, it's possible for the developing countries to leap over technologies, to literally jump, mobile phones being the most obvious example. I mean, most of Africa will never go through a fixed line process at all. But in other areas, there will undoubtedly be problems. You will have effectively the digitally illiterate, and that could amount to being, at the moment we know for sure it's at least 75 million children in the world, because the 75 million children aren't even going to school. So it's probably a number significantly greater than that. And that's, again, not an acceptable number. It's a question of technological compassion, in a sense, of understanding the benefits of being wired and connected and able, and not being complacent about the disadvantage that will necessarily come with being divorced from that type of technology, being separated from that type of technological advance. I am concerned. I do believe that as it were, the high end is galloping on at a tremendous rate. For example, a small thing. I work off 2 screens. I've only been doing this for the last year and a half, but the benefits to me and the way in which it's allowed me to, well, not just speed up my work, but the nature of my work has become much more sophisticated by having a data screen on my left and my email screen or correspondence screen on my right, is a tremendous step forward from constantly closing down programs, opening up programs, closing down programs. You suddenly realise what a redundant process that is. Now, it's not available for everybody, frankly, to have 1 screen, let alone 2 screens. So, if I ask myself the question, am I giving myself a terrific, benefit that just isn't available to most people? And is that in turn, is that fair, unfair? Well, I don't regard myself as, in a sense, as someone who's in competition with anyone else. But on the other hand, if you extend that out and look at homes and look at middle class, upper middle class kids who may well adopt 2-screen technologies very quickly, whereas when other young people are struggling to have 1 screen in the house, yeah, these divides necessarily could become greater and greater and potentially quite worrying. I think the question is about whether skills, knowledge, understanding to fully engage technology are more important than access. In a sense, it's a false choice. In that access alone, without skills and understanding, are plain frustrating, actually. I took out an entire summer holiday in 1999 in order to teach myself computer skills. It was absolutely clear the world was changing and I had to change with it. And it was the most frustrating month of my life. I mean, it was agony, but also probably in hindsight one of the most rewarding. I learnt enough to get me going, and now I find probably that not a week goes by when I don't discover something that I didn't know that I'm able to discover. Also, the programs themselves have changed out of all recognition in those 10 years. But without the understanding that I developed during that 4 weeks, the fact I had access in those days with ISDN access would have been an irrelevance, and I say possibly even actually frustrating. So these 2 things have to go hand in glove. I'm involved to a very great extent with educational technology and classroom technology, and there's some fantastic stuff already exists, but even better stuff coming down the line. Unless teachers are prepared to engage with the different teaching practice this involves, and a different form of confidence and a different form of relationship even with the class, then the technology itself can be not very valuable. In fact, you can almost make a case you go backwards. That in some cases, a teacher who isn't confident with technology but is struggling to use it can actually be an irritant to her own, his or her, normally it's her own class. So I think these 2 things have got to be absolutely hand in glove. I learned a huge lesson in about 99, 2000 when we decided to make a big investment in making teachers computer literate. It was a huge investment. Was that you had right across the board, you had teachers that became immediately quite sophisticated or quite imaginative. They tended to be younger, and others who became enormously technologically resistant. But the really interesting thing was this: when we started selling things like interactive whiteboards in the early days, the nature of the pricing of the package included training. So if a school bought a whiteboard package, it would also be buying training. And by definition, at least one of the teachers, normally one of the teachers, would become pretty sophisticated, and then that person would be in the school and teach others. As price points came down, as the pressure on pricing became more intense, one of the things that the manufacturers started dropping, and I think this is probably true in other areas of software and hardware as well, was they started dropping the free training. Now the school being asked to train. Now the school will try and cut corners and not train. So we then went through a very bad period of several years where a lot of kit was being bought and literally ending up in a cupboard because there was no one in the school competent to use it. So I come back to the point. that I do think the absolute connecting tissue of good technology is adequate, confident teachers to use it, in the case of teachers, but also personnel. So, yeah, access without knowledge and understanding is if anything, a mixed blessing. With it, you can change lives. I think one of the dangers of increasing technological sophistication is isolation. I even see it in my own life. I am perfectly happy spending a weekend on my own now, because I'm so engaged with what I'm doing, what I can achieve, what I can send to people, what I can receive from people. I almost don't need human interaction, and I say that as a negative, not a positive. And I do think it's an issue, and I think it's an issue that could become more difficult. I already know of at least one divorce absolutely caused by the fact that the guy in question, very, very sophisticated, very intelligent man, basically fell in love with his computer and couldn't be prized of it. And in the end, his wife just felt entirely excluded from his life. So yeah, these are issues. But on the other hand, I would argue that it's a brand new issue. It's an issue we've yet to kind of deal with and come to terms with, and achieve a balance within it. I also think that particularly Skype is only in its infancy, and a lot of the things we do in isolation now, we will begin to do, and we will begin to destroy the tyranny of distance. Now that's got to be a great thing. It's a great thing from the point of view of the climate, because we'll fly less, hopefully, and travel less. We will connect more, and we'll find new and more, I think, interesting ways of using that connection. My next big investment for me, living on the west coast of Ireland where I do, is a proper video conferencing, small video conferencing suite, probably not much bigger than the size of this room, but something really quite sophisticated, something where you can actually control the camera. You've now got technology to control the camera at the other end of the video conference, so I can talk to 2 or 3, 4 people, move in on them. I see that as fundamental to, I'm 69 now, I see that as fundamental as the technology for me to deal with me in my 70s. It means I can lecture at universities I can never get to. It means I can participate in conferences I'd never get to. And so I think the opportunity for my life to become quite rich in that sense is tremendous, as long as I also accept, and not just me, I think people generally accept, that it can become a tyranny, and you need people around you who are prepared to point that out to you. To me, the great challenge of the 21st century will be recognising that we've been given an extraordinary opportunity at the same time as being given the ultimate challenge, essentially, and that's climate change. What's brilliant about climate change is there's no them, it's us. For the very first time, we're in conflict with ourselves. Our own expectations, our own desires, our own anticipations, we have to come to terms with squaring the circle between what we want and what we can do with what we've got. And I think that it is going to be the ability of the human species to become humble, to understand with a great degree of humility that we are not masters of the universe, that we're actually, in a sense, scratching a living in a highly vulnerable environment, i.e. planet Earth, and unless we can find a way of dealing with it and taking the same amount out as we're putting in, or put in rather, same amount better take out, we do not have a sustainable future. I was at a brilliant lecture by David Puttnam recently, and he was asked a question at the end, which is whether we will survive to the end, whether the human species will survive the end of this century. And he took a long time to answer, and in the end he said, unless we can come to terms, first of all, with the implications of population expansion, and more importantly, of species loss. They didn't think we had a cat and hell's chance of surviving to the end of the century. And he went on to talk a lot about the issue of species loss, which is a very interesting one because it makes you focus. You know, he didn't say this, but 40% of everything we put in our mouths is the direct result of pollination of the honeybee. But we know that honeybee, for whatever reason, is stressed, and there is some kind of crisis going on. What we don't fully understand is what the implications of that are, and indeed what the implications of the loss of any number of other species that are fundamental to our own life cycle. So I guess the great challenge is that man, including women, man has to become humble about his ability to survive without the active support of a great number of other species, and then has to look to protecting and preserving those species as a means for his own survival. That's the challenge.